Hey all, my name is Rio. I'm going to be helping you all go through our reading test for Hamilton's ACT 7. The structure is going to be, we will start with a review of a passage, looking to identify any problems within the passage, what we refer to as P's here, identifying anything that was particularly important to the passage, kind of overviewing what's going on in it, and then moving on to review and correct every question through the test per passage. So as per usual, our ACT is starting with our prose fiction. The main thing that we're going to want to do here as we come into a prose fiction passage for this one and for any others is to remember, we're looking at three things in particular: character, tone, and structure. The thing that is unique about a fiction passage is character and tone. We know that character especially is not really present in any of our other passage types. And tone is something that is mostly unique to prose fiction, although we sometimes can see a certain element of its importance coming in on something like a humanities passage. But in this instance, we're really going to be focused on character and tone. And then lastly, structure, which is, essential to every other passage that we're looking at. But we see structure unfold in a different way in prose fiction. In our other passages, we see structure unfold on the basis of evidence, pointing towards the main idea. In our prose fiction, we're seeing structure unfold in a way of revealing something about our characters, revealing something about our setting or our situation, revealing something about potentially our narrator. So, an overview of what this passage is about. So we have a family, a mother, a grandfather, and a boy who is the mother's son, the grandfather's grandson, at a zoo. At the Zoo is the name of the short story. So right off the bat, we're given, there's an element of tone here. There's good writing. It's pretty funny. At the orangutan dome, the grandfather purchases a plastic cup in the shape of an orangutan head. He offers his grandson a sip. $8 for soda in a plastic head. The flesh and blood orangutan is dignified and bored. Its size and its body deflates. The family turns towards a glass case labeled Fennec Fox. Look, the grandfather says, weasels. So obviously, it's called Fennec Fox, but the grandfather chooses to say weasels. We're being introduced to an unreliable character. The grandfather, throughout the course of the passage, we come to find is a quote-unquote unreliable character. That means what they say officially is not what they really mean. We have an element of irony here. And it can be a little bit confusing to encounter that in a literature passage or a passage on a standardized test, because how can we kind of perceive that nuance? Well, we luckily have the mother who we can see into the brain of, be able to kind of clarify that this grandfather, her father, is unreliable. So we hear about the weasels, which are actually Fennec foxes here. And the grandfather says all of these sort of falsehoods about weasels, right? All in service of, I don't know, messing around with his grandson so they can hear things in space. They eat little boys, right? So, we're seeing some things, hear things happening in space. This is, I would say, a really important, right? This is where we have our unreliability. We might want to mention something that in our margins, in our kind of mental roadmap annotation. Something here is important. Here we really get that unreliability. We're really seeing evidence of this unreliability here, that weasels, like to eat little boys or snack on them. Do you know what their favorite foods are? The grandfather asks the grandson. The enclosure knows that what they really eat, which are not weasels, these are, of course, are not weasels' food preferences. These are fennec fox's food preferences. We know that the grandfather's lying here. Weasels love roast beef and key lime pie and kid stew. The people at the enclosure decide they do not care enough to bother saying anything. Let the foxes be weasels. What does it hurt? So the narrator clues us in that, you know, other people maybe see this as harmless, maybe they see this as whatever, but because we can see into the mind of the mother, even though we have a third person narrator, right? This isn't from the first person perspective of the mother. We're given a glimpse of what the mother believes. So the mother does not share their indifference. She grinds her teeth, but bites her tongue. She herself has been subject to these things. She was taken aside by concerned teachers. They were old humiliations. She wanted to make sure her son grew up on firmer footing, not subject to the kind of, you know, untruth, I suppose, that her father subjected her to. Here we really see, this is where we really see the interactions of the characters. All three characters come in line in this sentence. Someday, the mother thinks, her father will break her son's gullible little heart. This is most important. The mother is a patent lawyer. Her father is in town for the week visiting. She's using a vacation day. Because she does not want to leave her son alone with her father. That's pretty telling. Let's continue reading here. So they go to the rhinos. He wants to see the rhinos. But first they see capybaras. What do they eat? Fritos, he says. And then he goes and gives Doritos to the capybaras, right? We find that, why are they at the zoo? Well, it's because the son, the boy, seems to like animals. He watches Animal Planet, even though he has a hard time engaging with the brutality, the realness of the natural world, right? He sobs piteously when anything dies. That really characterizes this boy. This also characterizes the boy up here, we can see. He believes nearly anything everyone tells him. He has large, serious eyes and a look of constant apprehension, right? He's kind of a scaredy cat. He's sad. He's emotional. They go to the giraffes, and then we really get kind of the most intense lie from the grandfather. His grandfather says he rode giraffes in the war, a war that he barely was. I mean, he wasn't involved in the war. He was involved in the army, but he was never involved in the war. He just enlisted after Korea, but he tells stories because he's an old man, a grandfather. He feels like he has to conform to this sort of thing. Here we kind of have the final element that characterizes things. So the boy is really excited to go to the zoo. He's reading from this big book of amazing animal behavior. The boy's book explains that elephants are social animals, that the individuals in a family love each other very much. Here at the zoo, he noticed that the elephants are caged separately, snorting and kicking at one another. He asks why, and the grandfather steps in, says he understands. They had a fight this morning over their toys. They're sulky now, but they'll come around. Their grandfather's explanation makes perfect sense to the boy. and he is curious about what else his grandfather knows. So what we have here is a family dynamic in which all of the different members of this family kind of have different motivations, and they have different inclinations. We have a conflict essentially that's one way. The mother has a conflict towards her father, the grandfather character, or antipathy towards him. It's a conflict that doesn't exactly get resolved. We have some characteristics of the boy. He's sort of nervous, apprehensive, gullible. We find that the mother used to be many of those things, but has since kind of turned towards steady footing. She's a lawyer. She is concerned with practical measures, and she wants to instill that practicality within her son so that her son is not subject to the same kind of problems that she was subject to by being a gullible youth. And then we have the grandfather, who is performing what he believes his duties are as a grandfather, which is to be kind of funny, to, be an old man who was in the war. And he is, spending time just coming up with things off the top of his head. We don't really know why he's doing it exactly. But there's something about it that is sensible to the boy, and the boy is curious about what else his grandfather knows. There's really no conflict between the two of them. The boy's too young. So we're really seeing character here, and how it unfolds over the course of time and structure to reveal the nuances of character. That's the passage. So we'll move on to the questions in a second. So our first question here asks, which of the following best describes the structure of the passage? So the structure of the passage is related to what it did, what it functioned to achieve, which ultimately is a exploration of the characters present. Our characters being the grandfather, who's unreliable, the mother, who kind of is upset about the unreliability of her father, and the child, who is gullible, nervous, young, emotional, etc. And what is going on? What is the kind of setting or the plot? They're at the zoo. So the whole passage is focused towards revealing what we learn about our characters. So I kind of gave away our answer here, but what we're going to want to do is, by understanding what the passage intended to accomplish, which is teach us about who these people are, what their interactions are between each other, what kind of things define the character as created. We're going to think which of these answers best corresponds with that, and which of these can I get rid of that don't correspond to that, because there's going to be things that are probably distractors here. So our first answer choice, a series of humorous animal-related anecdotes relayed by a narrator. Okay, so there's some sort of humor in here. There is a little bit of animal, it's at the zoo, but a humorous animal-related anecdotes would make it seem like the whole passage is about that portion where, the antelopes pick their nose with their tongues or whatever. This is not what we have occurring. We're really focused on the interpersonal interactions of these people, the nuances that the mother perceives in the relationship between the grandfather and the son. So we can get rid of that. A dialogue equally divided among three members of the same family. There's actually very little dialogue that goes on here. Also, equally divided, that's kind of like a specificity distractor. Sometimes it's like, it's related to the two extreme distractor. It's where we encounter something that is so specific that it isn't valid. An account of a family's outing that reveals details about its members. That's pretty clear. That's pretty obviously in alignment. I'm going to basically half circle that. I'm just going to see if D potentially gives us a better option. D, a narrator's memoir of her family life in which she recounts its complications. That part, recounting its complications, that part's the wrong. We would maybe need to see a little bit more beyond just that one paragraph where she mentions that she was discounted by teachers, etc. we get details of all the members. We find out who all of them are. It's revealed over the course of time, the way that all of them respond to what others are doing. We get to see really the inner mind of the mother. We see the grandfather described and denoted by his actions, and the son by kind of his facial features and actions, the way he responds to things, his responses. So C is pretty perfect. C is a perfect one here. So question 2, in lines 13 to 18, he has snacks. The narrator indicates something about the boy. So let's just go ahead and return to that portion right here, lines 13 to 18. They already were kind of underlined in our initial reading of the passage, which you can go and watch if you want an overview of the passage from earlier. The boy clutches his grandfather's hand. He believes nearly everything anyone tells him. He has large, serious eyes and a look of constant apprehension. It makes it easy for his mother to forget his growing size, that he is too old now for the collapsible stroller she has brought in case he becomes tired. His legs dangle whenever she straps him in with the juice boxes and snacks. Okay, so I see 3 things going on here. We're going to see if any of our answers correspond to those 3 things. I see 1, he's gullible, right? He believes nearly everything anyone tells him. We see 2, that he's kind of, serious, large eyes and a look of constant apprehension. That's kind of like scared, nervous, uncomfortable. And then 3, it seems like his mother doesn't necessarily coddle him, but, as he's being taken care of by his mother in a way where he's too big for the stroller that she has for him. So these are the 3 things. We're going to see if any of these match up here. So when he seems nervous, okay. That wasn't me crossing that out. That was me trying to say that looks good. That looks good because, he is kind of characterized as nervous at first. I wouldn't say that maybe is the main thing in here. Let's see if something else is a little bit more primary. He drinks juice meant for younger kids. Okay, no, he doesn't suggest it anywhere. He drinks juice, but why would it be for younger kids isn't suggested. Is overprotected by his grandfather. Okay, this is the part that's definitely wrong there. It isn't his grandfather. And then fits into his stroller. It says he's too big. So the only one here that works is F. Seems nervous. Again, that little dash was intending to be on the side over here, just to say, oh, that looks good, which is usually the way I kind of work my way through passages. So it's the only one that works. Now, is that the best thing that those lines does? Is that like the biggest, most important thing that those lines do? I don't know. But it is the only one that's indicated, that the narrator indicates the boy does. That's of our options. So let our answer choices determine what we choose. Okay, so the grandfather tells the boy, question 3. The grandfather tells the boy that weasels subsist on a diet of all of the following except. So where did he talk about weasels? So we know they never actually see weasels. They see fennec foxes that the grandfather describes as weasels. So here underlined, you know what their favorite foods are? The grandfather asks. Everyone standing at the enclosure knows because the label lists them: plants, small rodents, lizards, and insects. So that we can get rid of because, that is what they actually eat, not what the grandfather says. Weasels love roast beef, the grandfather says, and key lime pie, and kid stew. He picks up the boy. We have 3 things: roast beef, key lime pie, and kid stew. So whichever is not those, we can choose. So roast beef, kid stew, key lime pie. Okay, not Fritos. Remember, Fritos are for the capybaras later on. That's that. Question 3. So according to the 3rd paragraph, the visitors at the fox enclosure likely find the grandfather's stories to be one of these 4 things. So let's read how they respond. The people at the enclosure decide they do not care enough to bother saying anything. Let the foxes be weasels. What does it hurt? That's kind of the key. We're really given the brain of these onlookers. So unacceptable, that it is acceptable. They accept it. They are fine with it going on. They decide to not care enough. So we can get rid of unacceptable. Typical. They don't find it typical. They know it's wrong. Everybody else typically knows what the foxes eat. They know they eat plants, small rodents, lizards, and insects. H, bizarre. Okay, so bizarre maybe could be correct. I mean, they're saying that they know it's wrong, right? So then maybe bizarre would look good. Let's see if J is better though. J, harmless. That's best, okay? That's best because they say specifically, what harm is it? None. They're willing to let it slide. They think it's fine. It's not that big of a deal. Bizarre is too extreme. Now, if J wasn't good enough, maybe H would be better, but J is perfect. J is perfect. So that's why we can choose J for question 4. Question 5 is really tied to character. This is our most important character question here. Which of the following best describes the mother's attitude toward her father? So what is it? Do we have any specific moments, right? The mother does not share their indifference. She grinds her teeth when her father speaks, but bites her tongue. Her whole life he has been telling these stories. Once she believed them. She was marked down, taken aside, and humiliated. She promised she would not want that to be the case for her son. So, what does that sound like? Sounds like frustration, embarrassment, maybe even anger. But she's quiet about it. She still hangs out with him. So let's see what we've got. Casual indifference. Okay. Nothing about it is casual, nothing about it's indifferent. She has a strong opinion. Profound shame. So she does seem to wince at old humiliations, at her old, ability or liability to believe in him. But profound is kind of too strong for shame. It seems like maybe like a light shame at most, and maybe not even shame at all. So you can get rid of B. Concealed irritation. Okay, that's a perfect sentence. We have this, these two sentences specifically are concealed irritation. So that looks really good. Great amusement we can get rid of because she's not amused. She says she does not have an amusement. So we can choose C, concealed irritation. So here we have a detail type question. According to the narrator, that means we're going to see something from the narrator in the passage. The grandfather's manner of sharing anecdotes is something. So remember, we're not given too much about the grandfather's brain here. We just have what the grandfather's doing. So we have to either discover, the answer choice is going to have to be a safe inference, right? It's going to either need to be something that the mother thinks, or it needs to be just a detail by what the grandfather says. So F, his new way of relating to and delighting children. Okay, new way, that's not right, because we know he's done this forever because he did it to his daughter, who is the mother here. So F is gone for 6. G, characteristic of his desire to amuse himself at all costs. Okay, at all costs is something of an extreme distractor. At all costs is, something that's tantamount with death or, violence or something like that. Something extreme, and that's not extreme. One of his many traits that others find socially unacceptable. So it seems like the mother might find it socially unacceptable, but these others are probably people outside the family. And remember, where he is encountered by people hearing him tell these lies, these little anecdotal lies, and they don't find it to be that big of a deal. They don't think it's socially unacceptable. They're like, oh, whatever, it's, harmless. Familiar to the mother from her childhood. Okay, this is true, right? Now, in an English class, we might come up with a different sort of inference that would be maybe a little more nuanced, a little more insightful, etc. But remember, we're on the ACT right now, and the ACT inferences are always going to be safe. They're always going to be putting us in a place where it is doubtlessly supported by the text. So familiar to the mother from her childhood, absolutely the case. She mentions that, right here, she had to deal with this when she was a kid, and it was cause for embarrassment. So that is why J is for 6. All right, so for 7, we have a kind of phrase and context question. As it is used in line 36, the phrase on firmer footing most nearly means. Okay, so we need to see what it's doing, what it's accomplishing in line 36 specifically. So let's take a look. She has promised herself that her son will grow up on firmer footing. So I already had that highlighted from our passage overview, which you can go back and review if you want at the beginning here. So she wants to have her son grow up on firmer footing. Firmer footing compared to what, right? Compared to the lying, kind of joking, etc. background that she brought to school because of her father, who is the boy's grandfather. She wants to reverse that. She basically wants the opposite of her childhood. So, 7, with greater physical traction. Okay. This isn't about hiking boots or anything like that, right? This is a metaphorical kind of thing, right? This is speaking metaphorically. So we can definitely get rid of A. B, with a stronger grasp on reality. That sounds pretty good initially to me. It is what she's looking for. There was a certain unreality to what she knew from her father. In a more prestigious social position. So I'm going to get rid of that. I think that this could be a little bit of a distractor in that, the problem that she encountered was given or evidenced socially, but the thing that she found to be the problem was just that she was being lied to, by a guy who's just making, little jokes up. The social position is just evidence to the fact that she was being lied to. With the ability to flee if necessary, okay, that doesn't make really any sense at all. So our only answer choice that makes sense here is B for 7. So for 8, we have a detail question. According to the passage, that means whatever is said here, whatever is our answer choice, is going to have been literally said nearly verbatim in the passage. So we just have to find this. F, will not grow up to be serious and responsible. So that might make sense to us. That might be reasonable to us on the basis of, well, if he's, finding all these lies from his grandfather, maybe he'll grow up to just kind of think everything's a joke because maybe his grandfather thought that. But is that in the text? It's nowhere in the text. So we have to get rid of it. Does it sort of make sense? Yeah, you could probably convince yourself it makes sense, but this is the ACT. It needs to be in the passage. We can't make up for ourselves what something might make sense. G, will be emotionally hurt at some point by his grandfather. Okay, this is said specifically. Someday the mother thinks her father will break her son's gullible little heart. That's exactly what B says, or G rather says. So I think G is good. I'm going to at least look at the other ones. H, this is basically the exact same problem of F. It's reasonable that that might be something, but it isn't suggested or stated in the passage whatsoever. That's just something that we might interpret from that, what we might be worried about if we were in a similar situation, but we're not. All we have is the passage to go off. And J will prefer the grandfather's company to anyone else, also just not mentioned at all. G is literally right in there. It says according to the passage, so we got to look at the passage. G, the mother is primarily concerned that her son will be emotionally hurt at some point. Okay, so for 9, we have just a word in context. We always have 2 parameters, right? Does this word fit the sentence, and does this word match one of the definitions of the other word that goes there? So we have enlisted. So looking at line 65, he enlisted after Korea and spent 2 years in Fort Greely. This is when he mentions the war. This is referring to his military background. This is when he joined the military. So right off, fought and succeeded. Neither of those really fit. Maybe wrote down his name, but it says enlisted. It doesn't say enlisted his name after Korea. We really only have signed up here. That's the only one that makes sense. So it fits the sentence. He signed up after Korea, and it fits a definition. Enlisted and signed up are synonymous to a degree. So we can go with D for 9. So our final passage here, our final question for this passage here, rather, the passage indicates that the grandfather does all the following except. So this is our except type question, right? We don't want to make an opposite distractor and select something that he does do, thinking that's what we're looking for. So, okay, F, accidentally misreads the zoo's informational signage. Accidentally stands out to me. So he does misstate the zoo's informational signage, right? But he isn't reading plants, small rodents, lizard, and insects as beef stew, key lime pie, and kid stew, right? he is not accidentally misreading that, fennec foxes are in fact weasels. He didn't just have a problem with his eyes for that. What we really have happening is that he is willfully misreading the signage. So that makes this one stand out. I think he doesn't accidentally read. He willfully misreads. G, feeds the zoo animals human snack foods. He attempts to, right? He gives those Doritos to the capybaras, saying because capybaras like Fritos, according to him. Now, do the capybaras actually eat it? I don't really know. Seems like they disappear into the reeds. We see that up here, but yeah, he does give Fritos to the capybaras. H, misinforms the boy about animal species and preferences. That's absolutely what he does. We have a ton of examples about that. And then J, falsely claims to have fought in the war. Yeah, he did say that, right? He said he rode giraffes in the war, which is evidently not true, right? The mother says he just enlisted after Korea was over and just kind of spent some time up in Alaska. He was never in a war. So the only thing that doesn't actually happen here is the accidental misreading. Now, he does misread it in general, but that's on purpose. He's doing that to mess with the sun. So that's the end of our first passage here. And we'll proceed to our other passages with the next bit. Remember, there's a passage overview for every passage. Okay, so our second passage here in this test we're going to overview is the social science passage entitled, we always want to read the blurb, The Hidden Life of the Office Candy Dish and What It Means When You Take a Piece by Bonnie Berkowitz, published in 2017 by the Washington Post. So remember the perspectives that we're always going to bring into a social science passage. We know that a social science passage is going to have a certain perspective or opinion, idea, a main idea that undergirds the passage as a whole. The best way to identify what that main idea is through an understanding and an examination of the structure. Where do we look for structure in social science? Evidence. How does evidence compile to lead towards a particular main idea, a main point, a thesis? Now, social science, as a distinction between natural science on the ACT, oftentimes doesn't employ strict, quantifiable data as its evidence. Now, that does not mean that what it uses to support its argument is not evidence. It doesn't need to be data in order to be evidence. We've, in fact, have this mentioned in the very beginning of the passage. We hatched our own very unscientific experiment in the Washington Post graphics department. Now, yes, it's an unscientific experiment. We don't have a control group. We don't have particular parameters of the methodology. We're not submitting this for peer review, but nonetheless, it still is, an experiment. So it can be utilized. So another thing that we're always going to look for in a passage is expert testimony. Social science passages base their arguments typically on some combination of maybe research or data or a study, as well as, most importantly, expert testimony. So what is an expert's testimony? This is when we bring in somebody who has expertise in the particular subject that's being examined, and we ask them to, or the author asks them to make some sort of claims, provide some sort of insight, etc. Now, we always want to differentiate, is this expert's testimony in accordance with or differentiated from our actual author's perspective, our actual author's evidence. So let's go through and see what we have here. So I'm going to employ a little bit of the mental roadmap annotation. I can't really write super well, so I'm just going to kind of give summaries of paragraphs. So the office candy dish is like the watering hole in the Serengeti. If you look long enough and don't spook the more timid creatures, you'll get a peek into the inner workings of an entire social ecosystem. Okay, this is important. What are we looking to determine or ascertain from the candy dish? Some sort of answers about a ecosystem, a social ecosystem of a workplace. So what do? They put a square glass jar of candy by a very friendly creator and see how it disappeared, how it was utilized. So this is kind of akin to science, right? This is our method. Now, is this method super deliberate? No, but it is still a method nonetheless. We proved, they say, some very obvious things. Chocolate is popular, journalists stress eat like crazy people, and candy corn is polarizing. All right. Proof. But what we really find is that people must interact. There's some sort of social calculus that comes into being. We watch how people behaved around the jar, especially because of Kevin. Nearly everyone who approached made some sort of noise. This is where we really get our kind of like our data. This is our results, right? Everyone needs to say something. Here we get our next paragraph is where we get our expert testimony. So I'm going to underline the expert. I'm going to bracket what the expert's testimony is. This is important. This is going to come up, I'm sure, in a question, or at least be a key to figuring out the main idea. So what is it? It is not surprising that people engage in some sort of acknowledgement. It is the Kevin stimulus. Kevin's presence injected social complications into the food decisions. People had to decide whether the candy was worth the interaction. So now we get a little bit more expert testimony here. This is all expert. All of lines 30 to 43 are expert. Basically, what he's saying is that multiple factors come to play in determining how we might navigate or how people might navigate using candy and the social interactions that come with it. Gender, age, and status differences play a role, as well as the kind of way that you feel about the person, whether they're attractive, threatening, etc. If Kevin was a burly biker, maybe people would be less likely or less inclined to take chocolate. Or if a supermodel, maybe there would be, more alpha male types coming over and interacting and trying to get candy. So basically what we understand now is that this evidence is leading towards a main idea. What is the main idea? That everything is, some sort of a social calculus. Human interaction and human encounter is what is the real interest of this essay. Now, if we have somebody who has a lot of authority, they mention, it's going to take a lot for people to go and try to get free candy. Case in point, the executive editor has a jar of peanut M&Ms in his office. Outside of his office is Angela Barnes. Most of the M&Ms are consumed by just 4 top editors during meetings. For the rest of the week, the risks outweigh the potential reward. So another factor comes in still about the main idea, right? Which is that social calculus and risk calculations are what determine how likely people are to access something which is ultimately free to them. If it's free, you'd think everyone would just go in and take all of it. Wouldn't that be rational? Right? Now you have free candy. For example, no one takes the last piece. Only the most uninhibited would be willing to risk appearing so entitled. So we're so concerned about social, we're not doing something that seems quote unquote rational. Finally, this is a little bit irrelevant, but maybe we now we get a little bit, about what Kevin is going on. Kevin is an obviously important person, but now we have the main part. Why do we have this happen? We want to prompt conversations that may have not otherwise occurred. Social interaction is important. This is why we have communal snacks, typical in Silicon Valley offices. This is all a way, again, we have our expert, a way to invite human interaction. So the main idea is that food, candy, is all a means by which we can encourage and instigate human interaction in an office place, but navigating those social constructions is a calculus that everyone takes or creates individually. So we'll see how that interacts with the questions next. So our first question, question 11. The tone of the passage can best be described as one of these four things. So in the review of the passage we went over, we were, making sure that there was a notion of a main idea, and there is a main idea, which is what is the purpose of food in a office place? What can it encounter? So let's get rid of two of these things right off the bat: fictive and narrative. Narrative would be essentially a first-person type accounting of saga, a quest, a story. Fictive, that would, of course, be kind of like a fictitious feeling, maybe satire or something of that sort. We don't have either of those going place. So now we're between persuasive and investigative. So persuasive, there would need to be a very clear intention to change a mind, to encourage you to embrace a similar viewpoint as the author. The author is really more examining or trying to figure something out here. There's a lot of consideration and a lot of application of what they believe. Now, does the author seem to have an opinion? Yeah. But is the article or the passage written in a way to encourage us to adopt that author's opinion as our own? No. Which is why it can't be persuasive, and we're going to choose investigative. Okay, so our second question for this passage, 12, it's kind of one of the more interesting questions we will see on the ACT. The opening lines, which are the office ecosystem, talking about the Serengeti. So let's read this again. The office candy dish is like the watering hole in the Serengeti. If you observe long enough and don't speak the more timid creatures, you'll get a peek into the inner workings of an entire social ecosystem. Very interesting. The author's making this analogy in order to emphasize something. So we kind of need to know the rest of the passage in order to figure this out. So the dangerous consequences of interacting with others. If this passage were focused on the literal danger of interacting with others in the workplace, if we maybe got anecdotes of people getting fired for taking candy or, getting their wages cut or anything like that, maybe we would have that. But none of the rest of the passage focuses on this, so we can get rid of this. We really need to be considering the passage as a whole. G, some environments clearly reveal social dynamics. Okay, that seems acceptable, right? That seems like it's true, and it doesn't go so far as to make itself invalid. Now, there might be a better option later on, so I'm not going to just circle G and move on, right? I want to get to this sort of certainty of knowing every other answer choice is incorrect, and I have a reason for why G is correct. So there is some sort of reason why G is correct. H, human nature in approaching different social situations. I don't think that this works. So this is not emphasizing human nature in approaching different social situations, rather that we have a particular environment. So we can get rid of H. J, the primitive social needs of a variety of species. Okay, obviously that's wrong. So it looks like G is our only option that works here for 12. I think H is something of a good distractor, but this focus on human nature, I think, is a little bit too much. And I think that these different social situations, I think, is the other thing that we can remove from H, which is why we're left with G, which has, it's perfect. It's all we need, which is very typical of an ACT question. Okay, 13, we have the inference question on the ACT. But remember, our inference questions are usually inferring by detail. There's going to be something in the passage that's going to let us know what our answer is. So it can be inferred that the team members observe the candy dish for a certain amount of time. So do they talk about how long this goes on? Yeah, they do. They talk about it when they mention that this candy dish stayed out. Oh my gosh, where did it go? Here we go. We tracked what we put in and how quickly it disappeared, starting the day after Halloween and ending well before Valentine's Day. Okay. Between Halloween and Valentine's Day, that's probably going to be a measure of 2 to 3 months, right? 2 weeks is too specific. A few days, not long enough. A few months looks good. Over a year, obviously not. So we're going to go with C. This is it's inference officially, but this is really a detail type question. So that's very typical of the ACT. We have C for 13. So 14 is a detail question. The passage mentions. That means we have this specifically in the passage here. Now we're basically just going to go through and find all of these which are referenced as true. So chocolate is popular amongst journalists is F. Okay, I remember seeing that, but let's just double check. So we proved some obvious things. Chocolate is popular. Okay. Journalists eat like crazy people, and candy corn is polarizing. Let's see if any of those are evident in 14. So chocolate is popular among journalists. Okay. We can get rid of that because they say it's true. Opinions are divided on candy corn. Okay, we can get rid of that. H, because it was mentioned, there's polarizing. H, people feel less guilty about taking mints than candy. Okay, I haven't seen that anywhere, but it might be somewhere else. Let's see if J is something we can eliminate to choose H. J, journalists seek out candy in an effort to combat stress. Okay, they say journalists stress eat. So good. We have H. It is the only thing that we didn't see. So in this instance, we really don't need to go out and prove to ourselves that we're not seeing mints, anywhere else. We saw chocolate. We saw polarized opinions on candy corn, which is synonymous to divided. And we saw that candy is a stress eating thing for journalists. All those things point to, well, we have to choose H. So that's our answer. So 15, we have another inference question, which remember on the ACT, our inference questions are ones in which we want to infer by detail. We want to basically, we're not out here making broad inferences of the kind that we might make in a English class. We're making inferences that are demonstratively suggested in the passage itself. So it can be inferred from the 6th paragraph that an alpha male is likely to have a candy jar, so A, in order to test his employees' confidence and even bravery. So that might be like reasonable to one of us who might think, oh, that would be, an alpha thing to do or whatever, but it isn't suggested in the passage at all. So we can get rid of A. B, filled with peanut M&Ms, an expensive favorite. Did they mention peanut M&Ms? Yes. But if we return to that, we don't see any suggestion of those being expensive, so we can get rid of B. C, from which not all employees feel comfortable taking treats. Okay, that seems to be the case because only 4 editors go in and take it. The rest of the worker bees don't think that the risk is outweighed by the potential reward. Barren status, the watchful eyes, the location in office, and the complicated lid are all too nerve-wracking, so they don't feel comfortable. D, regularly maintained by his executive assistant. She's watching, she's kind of understanding what's going on, but it don't suggest that she's going around filling it up. So that is why our answer is C for 15. So for 16, we have another detail question, which means, of course, we see something like according to the passage, which means the answer is going to be nearly verbatim in the passage. So according to the passage, when taking a piece of candy from Kevin's jar, most people feel compelled to do one of these things. So apologize to him. Did they ever mention apologies? No, they mention a polite ask, but they don't mention apologies. It seems like the thing that they really focus on, what everyone does, is that they emit some sort of noise. That's what we see right here, lines 20 to 21. So let's see if there's anything that lines up with him. So apologize to him, too specific. Make a noise, that's true. That's something that does go here. H, avoid eye contact. That might seem reasonable to one of us. Maybe we would think, that's what I would do. But it isn't suggested concretely, so we can get rid of H. J, pay a compliment. Again, we don't have it specifically referred to in the passage. What do they actually say? They all make a noise. Some just grunt, some are polite, some do any number of things. We had one person singing the Candyman. So that's why we know that G is the only answer for 16. 17, we have another detail type question as indicated by the passage. So we're going to be kind of thinking about what was said in the passage. Now, this is a little bit more of a main idea question. So if you're confused on this one, you might want to watch the passage overview that we already did. What question do people ask themselves when deciding to take a piece of candy? So what is the pervasive question that we see them being asked? Ultimately, the question is essentially what Wank brings up. You have to be willing to break into someone's. You have to say, okay, I'm worth it, and I'm going to come over there and talk to you. It's a question of, is it worth it socially? Is the social risk worth the potential reward we have underlined? So it seems like something that asks, or something that asks the question of, Do the risks outweigh the reward, or do the reward outweighs the risk, is where we're going to see. So is it worth the social interaction? That looks really good right off the bat. B, will this ruin my diet? They don't bring up diet whatsoever, really. The only time they mention is when someone says, shouldn't have a piece, and then they get some. That's not enough. We don't even actually explicitly know that that's diet. Am I being judged by others? That's interesting. It's pretty similar to A. I wonder if we can differentiate those two in a sec. D, how might this help my career? That's definitely one we can get rid of. So let's just determine between C and A what is better. Is it worth the social interaction versus am I being judged by others? So I think by am I being judged by others is going to suggest that we're only looking out for the negatives. Whereas some people, the focus seems to be mostly just on any type of social interaction. Invite human interaction, as we have underlined here in line 76. So A is demonstratively better than C because it is more specifically referred to in the passage itself. Okay, question 18, we have a word and context question. So word and context questions, we're going to apply our two-factor identification. We're going to think, do any of these words fit the context of the sentence, fit the context that would be replacing hatched? And secondly, do these words have a near enough synonymity? Are they synonymous enough to hatched to work? So it isn't just fit, it also has to have a little bit of synonym. So let's look in line 4, hatched. We hatched our own very unscientific experiment in the graphics department. Okay, an experiment that would incur observation of a candy dish in a workplace, an office. So we concluded our own experiment. It would be the finish, so we can get rid of that. We cheated. That seems to be pretty out of it. Birthed. That's synonymous, but this feels like it might be a little bit weird with fit. We birthed our very own experiment. Let's see, devised. Now this seems like it fits definitely with fit, right? We devised our own experiment. And hatched and devised, I think that there is enough synonymity there. So I'm going to get rid of birthed because it doesn't fit quite as well as devised. Whereas devised, it fits better and it has a little bit of element of being a synonym. So it hits both of the factors of our identification. So we can go ahead and say that J is sufficiently ideal for 18. So 19, guess what? We have another detail question, which this passage has had many of. We know that because we're asked, this passage indicates that to avoid looking entitled, people are unlikely to do one of these things. So we're looking, which of these is nearly verbatim or even verbatim put in the passage? So visit the candy dish regularly. So that kind of feels reasonable, but is that mentioned at all specifically in the passage? I don't think so, but we might want to search for that. I want to see what the other ones say. B, complain about the candy selection. That's one thing that wasn't ever mentioned. So we can get rid of it. I know that that wasn't mentioned and it doesn't seem reasonable enough. C, take the last piece of candy. Okay, to avoid looking entitled. That was actually specifically brought up if I remember correctly. So we're going to go up here and yeah, so we have it right here. This paragraph, we have, nobody wants to be seen taking the last piece. No one would be willing to risk appearing so nakedly entitled, other than maybe the most uninhibited. So that is in the passage. We see it directly. I think C has to work. A maybe is reasonable, but I haven't seen it in the passage, and in fact, it isn't there when we were to go back and double check. And then D, ignore the person offering the candy. That's absolutely not true. That's an opposite distractor, right? We always have an instance of people making a verbal note of the person offering the candy. So the only one that works for 19 is C, because we actually saw it in there. It's a detail question. So our final question for this passage, question 20, is yet another detail question. Like nearly all of the questions are on this passage, and as is very typical of the ACT, we're always going to be looking for specific details in the passages on the ACT. This passage compares the social advantages of putting out a candy dish to those of. So what we want to avoid is reasonable but unsupported distractor. We don't want to choose any of these distractors, which sounds sensible, sounds familiar, but wasn't actually brought up in the passage. So gossiping around a water cooler. that's something that we all probably know about as being something kind of colloquially associated with the office place. Now, was it brought up specifically in the passage? No. The only time we bring up water is when we talk about the Serengeti, right? The watering hole at the Serengeti. That is very different from a watering cooler at a workplace. G, taking up smoking. Okay, that doesn't really sound like that would be similar to this, but this is actually in the passage. We would need to identify, before we could get rid of G, we would need to make sure, is it in the passage or not? And going up, we see that in fact it is in the passage. And a more sinister motive could be a desire to burrow into the heart of an important social network. That would be why Kevin has this candy dish out. O'Neill said, as in the case of a banker she knew, of who took up smoking in order, as is the case of a banker she knew of, who took up smoking in order to interact with managing directors who went outside for smoke break. So other people are smoking that you want to use to climb the social ladder. I'm going to go smoke with them as well. I'm going to take up smoking to do it. So it's actually there for G. That's the advantages of putting out a candy dish. That looks really good. We didn't see H anywhere, and we didn't see J anywhere, so we have to go with G because it was there. Does it feel a little bit weird to say that there's advantages of putting out a candy dish in addition to, in the same way that there's advantages to smoking, which is a thing that we've kind of been taught to be is detestable? Yeah, maybe feels a little weird, but it's actually in the passage, so we have to choose it. So that's the final question for this second passage. We'll continue moving on. All right, so for our third passage here, we have our Humanities Passage. As per usual, we kind of know what to expect with the Humanities Passage. A lot of times we have a sort of retrospective or biography about an artist from the past. We may have seen some that have talked about, like, for example, Winslow Homer, a painter from America, Maine area in the 1800s. We have retrospectives on writers, descriptions of certain kinds of art. Sometimes they're less focused on an individual. Sometimes they're more focused on a general idea. This is one of our more biography type humanities passages. So adapted from the article, The Education of Virginia Woolf. So we have Virginia Woolf. So first things first, let's make sure that we're not going too hard into our what do I know of this coming into it. Probably many of us have been introduced to Virginia Woolf in some sort of regard. We know that she was maybe some of us know that she was an author who made some important contributions to literature. Some of us may know her as a feminist who made important contributions to the development of feminism in England. We can be aware of those things, but don't let them define what we read from this, because this passage is not about that really at all. It mentions it just a tiny bit, but it, for the most part, is focused on other things. So Virginia Woolf, who, we get this introduction that she's from an aristocratic, intellectual aristocracy of England, basically. A family of letters. However, despite she may have been from this kind of snobbish thing, she championed a democratic vision of literature and of the reading life. This is now where we're starting to get a bit of it. This next paragraph is where we start to actually find focus of what the main idea of this passage is, which is, of course, our goal on any sort of passage like this. Find our purpose, find our main idea, understand what the evidence is that leads to that. So before and throughout her career as a journalist, or as a novelist, Woolf was a literary journalist, which was a calling at the heart of her life's work. Interesting. So this is showing, this is actually going to be the focus. Not the fact that she's a novelist, but that she was a literary journalist. So here we mentioned that, some of her family was relevant here. So in her upbringing, she was a descendant of a century of quill pens and ink pots, says Henry James, who's a famous writer. Get a little bit of their family background, but all of this is building towards the fact that she is writing journalistically. This is our main point from this paragraph. Great professional pride in her ability, carefully developed ability, to compress and enliven her audience, her writing for her audience. She wanted this to be for the educated general reader, not for the academy. She wanted this to be for people like you and me, not for, someone whose whole life is devoted to studying or researching literature at the academic college level, doctorate, etc. So most of this essay, we'll find, focuses on the common reader. And that was how she characterized herself and how she is intending to write these. So she aimed them, so they're talking a little bit about some of her work. She aimed them at the eponymous type, the common reader, because that's how she characterized herself. The common reader differs from the critic and the scholar. He is worse educated, and nature has not gifted him so generously. He reads for his own pleasure rather than to impart knowledge or correct the opinions of others. Above all, he is guided by an instinct to create for himself, out of whatever odds ends that he can come by, a portrait of a man, a sketch of an age, a theory of the art of writing. So this is how she sees herself, and this is who she is writing for. So with that in mind, it's interesting that her background kind of comes from a different place. So even though her family was very well educated, a part of this intellectual aristocracy, Virginia Woolf, as a woman, was not able to be educated, we'll find. So Woolf, who's intensely conscious of her self-education, was intensely conscious of her self-education. True, her father had guided that education, and true, she was rigorously trained in the Greek and had read deeply. But as a woman, she was denied the systematized public school and the Oxbridge, which is Oxford and Cambridge, intellectual training that was the entitlement of the male members of her family and class. And she was acutely aware of her status, for better or worse, as a non-academic schooled amateur. So even though she got a ton of insight from her father, a ton of support from her father, she sees that there's a sort of distinction because she has not been a part of the academia in the formal, strict sense. So now we get a little bit more understanding of why. This is all building this evidence up, which is that this was, ultimately something that she was dedicated to, and she wanted to. Why would she want to express or make literature understandable to the common reader? Why does she see herself as a common reader? Well, because she wasn't able to be a part of the academy, even though she's very learned. Most intense praise for reading ever written in English. Okay. She loves reading. She became, so this is the last kind of part. So she became a financially secure novelist in 1928. So her books, her novels, her fiction became, a way for her to support her own money. But we see in this portion here, how much she worked for these relatively unremunerative reviews just for the sake of wanting to do them. She found that it was ultimately really important. Here we have essentially the exact same thing. So we can, if we're annotating here, we might want to just pair these together to show these two paragraphs are essentially accomplishing the exact same thing for this essay. Now we have the real good summation. The grand aim, and what shows off the main idea of this essay, Woolf's grand aim in this exhausting labor that took time and concentration away from her novel writing, for which she's famous, was to be able to make not nearly thousands of people interested in literature, but millions. She despaired at her failure, but her essays are for the ages, and in that longest of long terms, Woolf's ambition might yet be achieved. So she still might make thousands or millions of people interested in literature. That's her whole goal. She wants to generate interest for literature for the common person, despite being a member of this kind of literati, because she was not allowed to be a part of the kind of academic intelligentsia on the basis of not being able to go to Oxford or Cambridge, etc. So that's our passage overview. We're going to move on to the questions. Okay, our first question for this passage, 21. The primary purpose of this passage is to do one of these things. So let's just imagine how we might answer this question in our own words before we go ahead to our answers. An overview of the passage is present, there's a recording of an overview of the passage present. If you missed this question, you'll probably want to go back and watch that full passage overview, because that's the main way we're going to understand the primary purpose. So first part that we can look at, so the first thing we might say is that we wanted to find an answer choice which corresponds with the fact that she wanted to review literature in a way that made thousands to millions of people interested in literature, the common person that she felt, the common reader that she felt she was a part of. So raise doubts about the value of the journalistic pursuits. I would definitely get rid of A. That seems to be almost an opposite distractor. B, analyze the historical intricacies and challenges of publishing literary criticism. That's also too broad. That doesn't deal really with anything that we would say here. C, examine Woolf's dedication to making literature accessible and interesting. That's pretty good. I think I like that a lot so far. That really corresponds with what we're saying. Let's just look at D. D, demonstrate how Woolf overcame sexism in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is a good distractor. I think it's still C. The reason why I would get rid of D is because, yes, it does reference the racism that she had to experience, in the fact that she was barred from being a part of the public school system or the Oxbridge intellectual training that the rest of her family was able to do. So she was subject to sexism. But the primary focus of this is the fact that she is looking to make literature accessible. And this is more of, sexism is more of an influence for why C was so important to her. So we're going to go ahead and choose C for 21. So 22 asks a main idea, main purpose question, but with the specificity of the fourth paragraph. Remember, when we're asked these questions, we need to consider the context of the full passage. We can't find the meaning of this or the purpose of this paragraph if we're only considering this paragraph. So looking up here, this is the paragraph where she's talking about where the author is talking about the fact that Virginia Woolf was denied access to public school or Oxbridge. Let's go through let's think about what this was doing. As far as we described in the passage overview, which you might want to watch if you missed this question, this paragraph here really seemed to service as a reason for why she was interested in appealing to the common reader, because she herself saw herself as a common reader. So F, show how Woolf's sympathy for the common reader was rooted in her education or the education process. That looks pretty good. Let's see if there's anything that maybe is better than that. Provide a brief biographical sketch of her father. Obviously incorrect. Describe the culture that existed within British universities at the time. Okay, so so we get a little bit of an understanding of the fact that these universities were, not accessible for women, but that isn't the purpose. For one, is that the university culture at the time? We can't totally know. And secondly, is that the purpose of this? Definitely not, right? The purpose of this is to establish something about Virginia Woolf. J, illustrate the emotional turmoil that Woolf faced as a young child. I think young child definitely is the part that makes this obviously wrong, and there's other reasons why J would be wrong as well. Emotional turmoil, we don't really get that. So I'm going to go with F. I think it definitely makes the most sense here. Okay, the third question for this passage, 23, we have a word and context question. So we're going to go ahead and look, as used in line 11, the word calling most closely means. Remember, we have two factors of identification here. We have, does this fit the sentence? Do any of these words fit the sentence? And then secondly, do they match relatively synonymously the word that we have? So let's go up and just underline calling in line 11. So Woolf was a literary journalist, which was a calling at the heart of her life's work. Okay, so a calling, that sounds like something like an inclination, a drive, something like that. Let's see if anything kind of corresponds with that. So it's being used in that way. So requirement, that doesn't really sound right, unless maybe no, I don't think requirement sounds right. Mission, that aligns pretty well with our idea of something sort of drive, something that's compelling her. Detriment, definitely not. She sees this as positive. Specialty, I think doesn't work on the basis of it wasn't a specialty. It doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit, and also it doesn't really match a definition. So let's go ahead and choose B for this. I think that that definitely is the closest meaning we would have there. I maybe would have said something of like driving passion, etc., but mission works really well. Okay, so our next question for this passage, 24, we have a very clear detail question. According to the passage means it's in the passage. So we did see a specific part where she talks, or where the article talks about who Virginia Woolf's intended audience was. And where is it? We see right here that she aimed her works at the eponymous common reader. So let's see if there's anything. So common reader, we understand, is somebody who is, relatively educated, but is not a critic, is not a scholar, is somebody who is looking to read because they want to read. So let's see if anything aligns. So fellow writers, no reference of writers. Highly educated scholars, that's an opposite distractor. She says no about that. Average people, that sounds pretty good to common reader. Discerning editors is something maybe more like critics. So H is the only one that works there. Classic ACT style detail question. Very straightforward. Just find what was said in the passage. Okay, so 25 is very related to question 24. If you missed 25, maybe check out the recording for 24. Woolf believed that all of the following are true of the common reader except. So let's look at this portion where we get discussion of the common reader. Woolf says that the common reader differs from the critic and the scholar. He is worse educated, and nature has not gifted him so generously. He reads for his own pleasure rather than to impart knowledge or correct the opinions of others. So basically, he is not trying to, convince or share other things with others or correct their opinions, change their opinions, give his opinion. Above all, he is guided by an instinct to create for himself, out of whatever odds and ends he can come by, some kind of whole, a portrait of a man, a sketch of an age, a theory of the art of writing. He's trying to make something that makes sense to him. So A feels the need to share his opinions. Yeah, that's one thing that wasn't in there, right? He was actually the idea of the common reader is someone who does not feel the need to share or change the opinions. Not as educated, that was true. Reads for entertainment, that was true. Is similar to Woolf, also true. So A is the one thing that is not true. So that's why we're going to choose A for 25. Just watch out for that except if you miss this one. So for 26, we have another detail question. As indicated by the passage, Woolf was denied which of the following. So if you've missed this question, I would suggest you watch the passage overview because this is kind of the focus of it. But our answer is going to be J, a formal education. Let's look at where we see this. We see, as a woman, she was denied the systematized public school and Oxbridge intellectual training that was the entitlement of the male members of her family and class. So she was denied schooling, formal schooling. Now, did she receive education? To a degree, right? One of England's most learned men, her father, had guided her education, her self-education. But that self-education is not a formal education. So that is why we can confidently say that J. We know she had access to literary resources because her family was literary. We know she was paid for her work because they say she was paid 27 pounds, 28 pounds. And finally, we know that she received proper recognition. So that is why J is our answer for 26. Okay, 27, yet another detailed question. If you've missed any others in this passage or got the reasoning for any of them, you'll see we have a lot of detailed questions, as is very typical of the ACT. So ultimately, we just had to find which of these writers did Virginia Woolf write an essay on. So let's look at between the two places where she wrote essays. She wrote one on Oliver Goldsmith. So we'll see if there's any essay, if that name is there. Additionally, she wrote about Edward Gibbon. We'll see if either of those two names are there. Any other literary essays mentioned in here don't have names that she wrote. See a name here, Hermione Lee. That was something that's her biographer, Henry Drames. That's another writer. Let's see if we can see Oliver Goldsmith or Edward Gibbon in here. So Hermione Lee, we know that's her biographer. Edward Gibbon, okay, there we go. Henry James, we know not. Leslie Stephen. Yeah, we just know that she wrote about Edward Gibbon. And there it is. So pretty straightforward there. Make sure we're just reading carefully if we missed a question like this. Okay, so for 28, if we missed this question, I would implore you to watch the passage overview that is present earlier in this recording, because this question is an overall kind of main idea question. Which of the following best describes Woolf's motivations for writing unprofitable reviews? Okay, first, obvious opposite distractor, J, the need for a lucrative pastime. Why would an unprofitable review be lucrative pastime? F, fame and personal recognition. We know that wasn't the case. The passage suggests that there was a deep desire, a deep appreciation for literature. She loves literature. None of these other ones were present, and some of these others are opposite distractors. If you miss this one, I would really just recommend you watch the passage overview. That's the only way that you're going to really understand everything that comes into why H is correct for 28. Okay, 29, we have an interesting type of question. It's a rhetoric question, which has some element of the detail. We're looking at these specific lines to then understand or ascertain a particular tone, which is rhetoric. So let's go ahead and read these lines, 47 to 51. So taken as a whole, Woolf's essays are probably the most intense praise to reading, an activity pursued not for a purpose, but for love, ever written in English. Okay. This is very positive. Let's consider, though, this isn't overwhelmingly, it doesn't seem to be suggesting that she is doing anything beyond what this is. So taken as a whole, Woolf's essays are probably the most intense praise to reading ever written in English. Does she say that they are the best praise to reading ever? Not necessarily, right? They're just saying that they're intense, they're passionate. So let's see what we have here, 29. Admiration, okay, that sounds like it works right away. We'll see if we choose that. Resolve, B, no. Resolve would be sort of suggesting some sort of strenuousness. Surprise, no, that doesn't work. Awe. Okay, awe and admiration are both on the positive side, which is what we're looking at. But let's think about what awe connotes. Awe connotes a sort of almost godlike quality. There are a few things which are awesome, truly awesome in this world, things which can draw awe include, a lot of natural phenomenon. If we were seeing the author describe this accomplishment or her work as something beyond just being an intense version of supporting reading, potentially maybe something like Herculean or anything beyond that, maybe it'd be awe, but I think admiration is superior. So we have this best be described. Admiration describes it better than awe. Awe goes a little too far. Okay, so we have a final question for this passage, 30. In the last paragraph, the author implies that Woolf's ambitions may be fulfilled in the future due to something. So let's look at this last paragraph, figure out what Woolf's ambitions were and how those ambitions might be resolved. So Woolf's great aim in this exhausting labor labor that took time and concentration away from her novel writing. So this labor was the reviews. We'll see that these two paragraphs, labor is referring to what's in these two paragraphs. Her aim in this exhausting labor that took time and concentration away from her novel writing, was to be able to make not merely thousands of people interested in literature, but millions. She wanted to cultivate an interest in literature in the millions of common people that aren't doing that currently, the common reader, as she mentions over in line 29. She despaired at her failure, but her essays are for the ages, and in the longest of long terms, Woolf's ambition might yet be achieved. So this sounds like it's saying, over the long term, maybe Woolf's cumulative work, because it is so good and time is a long time, it will draw actually a million people or millions of people to find a interest in literature. So let's see if anything answers akin to that. F, her ambition was not a resurgence of interest in her father's works. G, the widespread reach of her essays among thousands of readers. That seems like it would be more of her aim. It might not be the reason why it was fulfilled. Let's keep that around though. H, the lasting impact and relevance of her work. Okay, that sounds pretty exactly correct. I think that looks better than G right now, if I were to be between G and H. J, the historical significance she holds, that's not what we have suggested here, because we're mostly focused on her literary journalism rather than her being a female writer. So the widespread reach of her essay among thousands of readers is actually maybe not the case, because she says that she failed with that. So we can get rid of G, go ahead and select H, and we are now done with this passage. If you missed any of these, I would really recommend taking a look at the passage overview, which comes before the questions here. We are going to move on to our final passage now. All right, so let's talk about our last passage here, which we have is a natural science passage. More than really any of the other passages, or at least as most important as the other passages, it is for us to find a structure that conveys a main idea in the natural science passage. Very often, science passages will incorporate some sort of structure related to our method, or we'll start with our question, move on to a method, find results from the study, the method being either a study or the experiment. We'll find some results, and then we'll consider the consequences, conclusions, significance of those results, and then incorporate the scientific community into determining whether or not there were any challenges or problems with the method that they employed. So this passage here we have titled, Birds Struggle to Keep Their Marriages in Rapidly Changing Urban Environments. So we're talking about birds here and marriages. So that kind of initially is sort of interesting. As far as I am aware, their birds are not recognized in marriages by the state or any institution. So marriage is an interesting term to use here, obviously. Let's talk a little bit about where we're starting off here. So marriages can break up for a variety of reasons: financial issues, the stress of raising a family, or simply growing apart with age, to name a few. Of course, this sounds familiar to humans. It sounds like they're talking about humans. But for songbirds, the problem is often more prosaic. Pesky humans who encroach on prime avian territory and drive bird families out. Urban development can force even the most devoted monogamous pairs to split up in search of new mates and better lives. New researchers have found that for some, the decision can have unfortunate consequences down the road. Okay, so here's kind of our problem, maybe, or question. And it is essentially, our problem is that urban development can force even the most devoted monogamous pairs to split up. Now we're going to get a little bit closer to our question. When we come in and develop, we're often causing songbirds to fail. We're causing them to move and to find a new bait, a lost year of breeding. So they're probably going to try to figure out to what extent did this have an impact. So we hear a little bit about bird populations being impacted by human encroachment in other regards. So we have striking windows, killing cars are killing, but the hardest thing to suss out, kind of an interesting word choice, is whether lower breeding success or poor survival rates is impacted by the urban environment. So now in our next paragraph, we get our method. So this is the way that they're going to study it. So what is the study? They're monitoring 5 forest reserves, 10 urban areas, and 11 sites that transition from forest to urban landscapes, and capturing and color banding birds of a number of species. Method part 2. 6 species of songbirds. They split into 3 different categories. Those that tend to avoid human development, avoiders. Okay, this sounds like a technical term that we're going to need to know for the rest of time, or at least our time on this passage. So we have avoiders, those that avoid development, adapters, and exploiters. These 3 categories are becoming relevant, especially I think avoiders on the basis of this being about urban development causing problems. No really other technical terms seem to be particularly problematic up to there. It's worth noting that from the researcher's perspective, success in songbirds doesn't have to do with achieving lifelong fulfillment. Again, kind of this human idea. It was measured by whether or not a bird couple raised and fledged at least one offspring and therefore passed their genes to the next generation. I think that's pretty important. That's going to really tie into our conclusion, which we're inevitably going to get probably based on the fact that this is following a real science passage, typical structure at the moment. By that metric, avoider species didn't do so well. Okay, here we're starting to get some results. That's an R for results. Birds were often forced to move twice as far to find mates as more adaptive bird species. Once they got there, their nests were less successful. The reason? Divorce. Puts obstacles in front of future mating success, since birds have to worry about setting up in a new territory. So we're seeing our results. We're finding out that our avoider species are the ones that are most impacted by urban development. So here we have a little bit of a pivot. I'm going to put a P for pivot. This is pretty interesting to have this pivot here. We're pivoting away from this discussion of urban development and monogamous pairs to just considering monogamy of birds in just sort of a general sense. So here, some seabirds, researchers are finding that sticking blindly to monogamy can be just as wrong-headed. These birds' terns, basically common terns, stay monogamous, and even when the monogamous, their partner is unproductive. So now, it's not romantic. It's not human. Why are they doing it? It's simply based on availability. It's not driven by I'll do better with this guy or this girl. It's simply based on availability. Crucial point there. So here we have another little method for this kind of portion, which is almost like another science passage embedded within a science passage, which is what creates this an interesting science passage. So here we found another result. Common terns are monogamous to a fault. Humans might interpret this behavior as loyal. They stick by their mate even when their mate is incapable of producing offspring. Here we have our classic challenges. So CH for challenge / next step. This is exactly that. So more studies need to be done to figure out if there are ulterior motives that justify terns sticking with a single mate. Perhaps the energy it takes to get a new mate is more it's more energy efficient to stay with the old mate than to try to expend energy to get a new mate. Even though it might impact the genetic legacy. So what are our 2 general main ideas, it seems like? One, we have a main idea that we have an overriding main idea discussing to what extent are birds monogamous and what are the motivations, the ecological motivations behind monogamy in birds. Sub idea number 1, songbirds. What kind of songbirds are impacted the most by human development and their ability to rear young in a monogamous setting. And then subtopic 2, what about these seabirds? Why do they stay monogamous even if it is detrimental? In both cases, it seems like the patterns they're choosing is detrimental, although in the songbird case, they're making that decision because of us. So that's the passage overview. Let's move on to the questions. So this first question here on this passage, the primary focus of this passage is, so this is question 31. If you got this question wrong, my first recommendation would be to watch the passage overview, which was a little bit earlier in the video here. That's going to be the most important thing we do in order to determine the answer to this question. But just based on what we've seen, we know that this is a little bit about why birds might stay together, why other birds might stay apart. And we have two different kind of considerations. We have seabirds and we have these songbirds. So A, how songbirds select their mates. Because it's songbirds, that's too specific because we know we get into turns, so we can get rid of A. B, the mating behaviors of certain bird species. That seems relevant. We have a couple of different species that are considered at the beginning, and then we have terns at the end. It seems about right. C, how songbirds, again, too specific, cope with modern technology. Again, we can get rid of that. Even though that is a focus of the passage, even though that's a main or a significant focus of the passage and is not the primary focus of the passage. Lastly, D, avian survival strategies in large cities. That wasn't addressed. We only really talked about the fact that there are some birds who do survive or cope with large cities. So our answer, the only one that makes sense for 31 is B. Again, if you got this wrong, watch the passage overview. Okay, so it can be inferred that birds divorce. This is question 32, mainly because of. So divorce is in quotes, sort of weird to be using divorce here, but why do typically monogamous bird pairings split up? We find throughout the passage, especially up here, that the divorce, oh, this is where we get divorced, but why do they divorce? When we come in and develop an area, we're causing songbirds to fail. Urban development can force even the most devoted pairs to split up. So it seems like human development is the main one. So let's see if any of these answer choices are similar to human development. Family stress, that was a human reason for divorce. Growing apart, human. Desire for new opportunities? No. We just have human interference. Desire for new opportunities is too personified. They need to exploit new opportunities because where they had previously been has been disrupted, but human interference is the reason why they're seeking those new opportunities. And additionally, it isn't really a desire, it's coerced by our activities. So G is the only sensible answer for 32. So 33, in the first paragraph, the author anthropomorphizes birds by, okay, so first thing first, we need to know what anthropomorphizes means. So what do we, if we don't know this right off the bat, a couple of things we need to do. Anthro, human. Morph, change. Anthropomorphize is to change to be human-like, to make like a human. So we want to look at the first paragraph and see how the author might make birds seem human. So what I remember from the first paragraph is that this is where we start out talking about marriage from a human perspective, and then put it into the notion of bird mating habits. So marriages can break up for a variety of reasons, and then we list some human reasons: financial issues, stress of raising a family, growing apart with age, to name a few. But for songbirds, there's really only one problem: pesky humans who encroach on prime avian territory and drive bird families out. Urban development can force them to split apart in search of new mates and better lives, even the most monogamous pairs. For some, this decision can have unfortunate consequences down the road. So it seems like through comparing marriage of birds to typical problems experienced by humans in marriage is where we are seeing this anthropomorphizing happen. So let's see if any of these are kind of correspondent. A, describing the bird's psychological states. We're not really getting that to any degree. That would be sort of absurd. Assigning the birds names, that's not happening. There's no bird named George. Writing dialogue for the birds. Again, none of the birds are saying what they believe. So really, we just have ascribing human motives, which is this sort of like desire for a better life, kind of putting these ideas implicitly, suggesting these are similar motives. That's why we can choose D for 33. All right, so for 34, the author implies. So this is going to be almost directly stated in the passage. Remember, with the ACT, our implication inference questions, we still want to imply or infer by detail. So the author implies that man-made structures threaten birds in ways that are any of these four options. So entirely negligible. That would be meaning that they have no impact whatsoever. If you didn't know what negligible is, think about, this prefix neg, things like that. So they do have a significant impact. We see that throughout the whole first half of the passage, so we can get rid of F. G, totally unpredictable. We can get rid of that as well because we do see it's pretty predictable. When there is human development, avoiders get messed up, and adapters and exploiters manage to succeed. H, comparatively short term. That one's interesting because they do mention here they're caused to move and they have a lost year of breeding. We see that from the researcher's perspective, it was mostly that they had to move for a little bit. They have to find new territory, new risks, new competitors. Let's see about that. The last one, tragically irrevocable. That seems potentially too extreme. So we'll go with H. Tragically irrevocable would mean that man-made structures threaten all birds in a way that is so significant in impact that there's nothing we can do to bring them back. Of course, if there's exploiters, if there are adapters, J can't be true. It might be true for just the avoiders, but it isn't true for birds in general, so we cannot choose J. It's a too extreme distractor. That's why we have H. All right, so 35, we have a very typical word in context question. So as used in line 30 and as used in line 25, excuse me, the term whether most nearly means. So let's just go ahead, find whether in the line and apply our two-factor identification scheme of what is this word fitting and what is this word meaning, and then looking at our answer choices, do these words fit the sentence portion, and are they relatively synonymous? So let's go ahead and look at 25. To find out, how much of an impact changing habitats affects bird populations in survival rates. So to find out, OLIR collected a wealth of data on how bird pairs of different species weather ecosystems in transition. So that weather there seems like it means to handle or to persevere, something along those lines. So wear away. How well these bird species wear away ecosystems. So they're not wearing away an ecosystem. So is that synonymous? Yeah, sure. Weather can mean that. Does it mean that here? No, it doesn't really fit. Succumb to. There really isn't a synonym there, so we can get rid of B. C, survive in. That seems pretty similar to what we were talking about with regard to handling. D, flourish in, weather and flourish. Those things are not synonymous. We haven't seen those synonymous before, so we can get rid of D and go ahead with C. Let's just read it. Wealth of data on how bird pairs of different species survive in ecosystems in transition. Sounds exactly right. We know it's relatively synonymous, so we're good for C for 35. So for 36, we have another inference question, which again, we need to infer by detail. We always want to make a cautious inference. We don't want to be going too far with our inference. So our first option here is encountered more predators in their new homes regarding avoiders. So remember, avoiders in this study, you might want to go back to the passage review if you missed this one, because we learned that avoiders had a lower success rate with how well they did compared to our exploiters and adapters after there was human development intervention. So encountered more predators in their new homes. So there was a mention here that there were new competitors, but competitors versus predators. Competitors in this case probably means competitors for mates. So I'm just gonna that seems like it could be possible. Let's see if there's anything that's better though. Primarily male. Nothing suggests that. Overcame harsh challenges without severe consequences. That's an opposite distractor. We know that it was worse. So looking between F and then this J here, reproduced less successfully than their counterparts. J is just true. So it's going to be good. We're going to choose J. So there might be some of us who wonder, how is that an inference? Well, if we know that they didn't do so well by that metric, that's an inference. They don't come out and say this exact sentence. Additionally, remember, we infer by the detail. So we're on the ACT. We always infer by the detail. That's going to get us J. Okay, so for 37, we have a detailed question that is a methodology question, little science-specific type question. In order to study the songbirds, researchers used one of these 4 techniques. So we conveniently, in our passage overview section, annotated this in the mental roadmap format to show us where our methods were for the songbirds portion. So let's just see what the method is and see what they did, what they used. So here we have it. They captured and color banded birds of number of different species to identify individuals. There it is, color banding. That is perfect. None of these other ones are ones that we see. So for 37, we have to choose B. That's as simple as a methodology question is. Just remember, if you missed a question like this, remember we're letting the passage dictate. We're letting the questions dictate when we're going to return to the passage. Question like this, we got to return to the passage. Don't try to answer a question like this without looking at the passage and finding this in there, because that's going to be a foolproof way to be correct, is if you use this question and you use the answer choices to find it in the passage, you're not going to miss it. Okay, so 38 is an interesting question here. The published proceedings of the Royal Society B concludes that the Terns motivation in prizing monogamy is most likely one thing. So remember, this is on the kind of second research topic that comes up, which is about the Terns' almost illogical commitment to monogamy. What seems like illogical, but what ultimately the society deems is just an ecological decision. So the author and us the author suggests that some humans might suggest that that might interpret this behavior as loyal, potentially romantic. But what we find is that Fernando Colchero says, it is simply based on availability. It is all about opportunity. This is strictly explained ecologically. This is a matter of convenience or sensibility. It's rational. So let's see if anything aligns with that. So seeing romantic, we know that that's a distractor. That's what maybe typical humans would think. Traditional, same thing. They don't have the same sort of traditional cultures that humans have. We're between practical and unnatural. Ultimately, practical is the one that most aligns. G, unnatural, is sort of a reasonable but unfounded distractor, in that, yes, it might seem illogical or maybe unnatural to not want to, pass on your genetic material. But ultimately, what does the Royal Society B conclude? It's just a practicality-based decision. So F for 38. All right, so 39, again, this one is about the terns. So as we overviewed in the passage overview, the first portion of our passage is about songbirds. The second portion of our passage is about terns. So the seabird research suggests that terns, one of these things. So what was the big point about terns? They partner for life regardless of whether it's actually conducive for their ability to procreate. So partner for a lifetime is definitely the one that is going to work based off of what we read here, which is that all of this focus is about the fact that they partner for a lifetime, even if it doesn't work out in their favor, or at least in their, with the goal of producing offspring. So if you missed this one, I would suggest absolutely that you watch the passage overview to get a bit of an understanding with this. Urban encroachments, that's about the songbirds. A and B are also probably songbird distractors. They take place in another portion of our passage. So that is why 39 is C. Okay, our final question for the reading section overall, and for this passage in particular, is a main idea tone rhetoric question. So this is basically asking about rhetoric and an overall idea of rhetoric. 40, the overall tone of the passage is one of these things. So ultimately, we're just going to have needed to have watched the passage overview if we missed this question. Once we have explored the passage as a whole, we can maybe start making some judgments on these different answer choices. So with this, each of these is going to be relevant. Each of these different adjectives and verbs are going to be important. So for the first one, joking and sarcastic. So there's a little bit of humor in the passage. That's fine, but sarcastic is usually biting. We don't have any sarcasm, so we can get rid of F. Passionately argumentative. Definitely not. Never really argumentative. Never, I mean, maybe a little bit of passion, but definitely not argumentative. Get rid of G. H, objectively informative. That's where they would just be seeking to inform, and that's really the primary goal. I would say that that's probably it. So don't worry. Objectively doesn't mean cold or clinical or, you know, lacking in personality. There can still be a writer's voice if they're being objective. They're just being objective. They're determining what are the impacts of these things, even if they kind of do include a little bit of voice. J, condescendingly hostile. That is really off. So the only one here that makes any sense is H. I would also say maybe some of these words had a bit of a problem here. If we didn't understand what condescendingly meant, maybe that was a distractor or a problem in figuring this out. But if we know what all the words are and we've seen the passage overview, it should be pretty evident that H is the correct answer for 40. And with that, that's the end of our reading section. Talk to y'all later.